Well, I got to do some housekeeping right away, so let's cover some bases. First of all, I don't know if you knew that we have it's number one seller on the at the Northgate Church. Jennifer Chamberlain, please stand up. She is the author of a new book called Fresh Fruit, Meditations on Fruit of the Spirit. It's in an Amazon or Kindle near you. Also, next Sunday, let me kind of preface next Sunday with this. I was going to start a new series on a foundation, a tale of two houses, and how we need to build our life and what needs to be in the foundation of our life. And then approaching this Sunday, I'm thinking to myself, oh my goodness, we got basketball camp next week. And so I do this every year. I've done it every year, I think, since I've been at this church, and that is I preach from Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. It's one of my favorite passages, so we're going to be getting to that. And it's called The Big Squeeze this morning. And you'll see why I say that in a minute. But next Sunday at 9 o'clock, we have two services. Terry announced that to you. If we have as many people as we are predicting this week, and next Sunday at 11 o'clock, we do the awards ceremony, and we have a barbecue out on the lawn. This place will be packed. So I'm encouraging you, if you're not involved in basketball camp and you just want to attend just a regular service like we have right now, it's going to be a full worship service, it's going to be a full message, everything like this, but just dial the clock back to 9 o'clock. So be a part of that. Give everybody some space next Sunday. Will be fantastic. Now, Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Most of the time what we do is we do this, and I'll just read it. Therefore, I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. And you read that and you look at that, and it's one of my favorite texts of all time, because I preach on it every year. And you've been here for a while. You know that I do. I love this text. It's just awesome. It just jumps at you. But this morning, what we usually do is we just read that and go like I just did. Isn't that fantastic? Isn't that super? That is so rich. I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies a living sacrifice. We need to commit, and we go all the way down the list, and it's fantastic. But what we miss much of the time is the word therefore. Now, before I go on to therefore, let me set the stage a little bit about Romans itself, the letter that Paul writes. He wrote this when he was in Corinth for the winter, around 56, 58 AD. And it was at just the turn of between Claudius and Nero as emperor at Rome. And you see the church, it's amazing. I mean, this is like 20 years after the resurrection of Jesus. And the church has blossomed, it's flourished, it's growing. It grew all the way to Rome. And you have Paul knows and sees and experiences and hears people that have come from Rome, that there's a church there and that God is blessing it, and there's no leadership. If there's ever a chance for the church to go sideways, it would be where there's no leadership. But no, that wasn't the case. But Paul's urge and desire is he wanted to go to Rome. He wanted to establish a great church there, and it already is happening. But what happened is before Paul writes this letter to the Roman people, in this church you have Jewish Christians. Now, we're talking people that went to the synagogue and worshiped God and heard this message about Jesus Christ? He's the Messiah? He is risen from the dead? I mean, there's no Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John yet. There's no book of Acts yet. They're hearing about this amazing event called the resurrection. And Jesus is the Messiah. And you have some of the Jews becoming followers of Jesus. And now you have Gentiles that don't really know much about the history of the Jewish people. God begins to minister and speak to them, and they're getting saved. So the church begins to grow. We're not talking about a church that is this big church in Rome. We're talking about people that assemble together and meet together and just study about who Jesus is and who God is in their life. It's such a fresh, new beginning, and Paul longs to go. But just before Paul writes this letter, Claudius expels all of the Jewish people from Rome. All of them. He kicks them all out. They're just difficult people. They're hard to deal with. They are stubborn. It's like they're causing problems. Claudius just expels them all from Rome. And Paul actually talks about that in the book of Acts. And so now you have Nero coming into power, and he, believe it or not, he relaxes what Claudius did and is allowing some of the Jewish people back to Rome. What's interesting is that the Jewish people come back into Rome, and the Christian Jewish people are seeing the church exist and function and work where there was no synagogue. They were meeting in their homes, and they were flourishing as a church. So Paul is concerned, and he's writing this it's a long letter to the Roman people. That's the context of Paul writing this letter. Is you have a church now, you have Jewish people who are believing in Jesus, and you have Gentile believers who have grown and matured, and you have a church meeting together, and even the Jewish Christians are coming back going, wow, this is amazing. The church is still alive. It's still functioning. It's still real. Jesus is alive in these little churches that are meeting in homes. It's a beautiful picture. And the Apostle Paul still hasn't gone there yet. The leadership. How is it? Isn't that the beautiful thing about Jesus? Is we think that it has to be this structured thing that some leaders will sit down and organize and strategically plant everything and have it go just the way they want it. That's not really the way the church started. It was oftentimes God would move and then the leadership would follow. Isn't that interesting? Sounds like Antioch. And you look at this, and it warms my heart. It blesses me, is that God is alive in people's lives. And it's not just a structure, it's an organism. That Jesus really does work and move, even in the midst of what we might think is chaotic. But he's there. And let me say this too. People will say, well, this younger generation that's coming up, I don't know about them. Let me tell you something. Every generation has said that about the younger generation. But you know what? I've seen some of the younger generation. I'm impressed with them. I'm amazed with the younger generation that I see coming up. I look at them and I go, that's cool. That's great. And we are blessed. I believe the church is in good hands. Amen? Love the younger generation. Now let's get back to the word therefore. When you see the word therefore, you basically ask yourself the question, you've heard this before, what is it there for? It basically means this, in view of what I just said. So here you have Paul in an extremely long letter. He starts off with chapter 1. By the way, they didn't have chapter and verse back then, but let's just use that because we understand it that way, okay? You have chapter 1, chapter 2, all the way up to chapter 11. You have Paul just going on and on and on about so much about the Jewish people and the Gentiles. And he's laying down an amazing amount of doctrine there. And then he gets to chapter 12. And he says, therefore. When you just finally think you've got a break, when you finally think now we get to apply all this, he says the word therefore. So what does that mean? You got to go back and ask the question, what is it there for? In view of what I just said. So this doesn't make any sense unless you go back and you understand what chapters 1 through 11 are all about. Now, we're not going to go do a quick survey of chapter 1 through 11. Thank you this morning. It's only a series of 2 messages. But he says this, therefore, I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy. So his challenge to this church is he says, therefore, from what I just said, what did he just say? He goes on and talks about the Jewish people and the blessing and how God called them and how God uses them. So therefore means to reflect on back. If you really want to understand the mercy of God, you got to go back through and look at Israel. You got to go back and look at history. You got to go back and look at the mercies of God because they're absolutely amazing. You look at Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Paul brings this out in chapters 1 through 11. He talks about Abraham, how God called Abraham to bless all people. And you look at the fact that God cares enough about us this morning to say, I'm going to call Abraham. And through Abraham, I'm going to bless all people. That's a beautiful promise. That's a beautiful blessing. But here's the struggle. You have some of the people in Rome who are Jewish believers. And you have Gentile believers. You have Jewish people there in Rome who don't believe that Jesus is the promise, is the blessing. They reject him outright. And Paul's heart is burdened for them. It's burdened for his own people. But can you understand the church and what they are going through and the struggle? And Paul says, therefore, I want you to look at the past. I want you to look at God's people. But God's people are rejecting the answer to the promise that was given to Abraham. Can you imagine what's going through the Gentile mind? You know, they're just like, Jesus saved me. He's built a relationship with me. We worship him. I understand who Jesus is. Why don't the Jewish people follow him? There's a dilemma here. There's a problem that Paul is addressing. So when he says, therefore, we've got to look at this problem because this church is going, I don't know how to handle this. Some of the people follow him, but many of them do not. Many of them reject the promise. But what does Paul say to them? He tells them, God's calling and his decree to his people are irrevocable. That just because they're rejecting him doesn't mean they are rejected. That his calling to them, that they could be grafted in, that they could be brought in if they stop hardening their hearts. That's the mercy that Paul is talking about here, that we need to understand, that we need to hear, that we need to listen to, is the fact that God has mercy on those who have rejected him. Not only that, you can go all the way back. You can say, look at the people of Israel. Paul goes all the way out to Abraham. Let me start over here. He goes to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Then he goes to Moses. He deals with Pharaoh and the call of the Hebrew people out of the Exodus. He brings them up to Mount Sinai and the giving of the law. You can go all the way through to the promised land and the conquering of the promised land and the giving of that promised land to God's people. And then you have the kings, and you know King David and the blessings through that. And you can look at all of this and you can you can look at God's blessings, and you also look at the Jewish people and how many times they blew it. I mean, we can all sit here this morning and go, oh my goodness. If you ever want to feel good about yourself, just read the Old Testament. Right? I mean, you look at all of the mess. You look at the people that they followed God and then they didn't follow God. The miracle would happen, they'd go, oh great, mighty is our God. And then the next minute they would be rejecting him. I mean, it goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And what Paul is saying, therefore, in view of God's mercy, through all of the Old Testament, look at it. His mercy is amazing. But still the dilemma at Rome with the Gentiles and them seeing their brothers and sisters in Christ who have received Christ as their Messiah, but there's many of them have rejected Jesus, and he's the King of the Jews. Think about that. Let's see. The message of Jesus is that through God's people who bless all nations, as a Gentile, we're those who are being blessed, but a lot of his own people are rejecting him. That can cause problems. Think about this. I'm going to give an illustration. I know it's kind of it's a tough illustration, but I think it makes sense. It'll probably be shocking. Let's picture for a moment, let's remove ourselves into a Christian setting today where a leader, and this happened, a pastor of a church of about 500, had an affair with his secretary. Ran off with his secretary. The church is devastated. It's like this person who was following Jesus, this person who taught us, who stood up in the pulpit and preached God's word, is now turned his back, left his family, devastated, and the church is standing there. What is going on? You see, this is what the Gentiles were feeling a little bit in Rome. It's like the Jewish people are the ones who the promise came through. Jesus is King of the Jews, but they rejected their king. The district superintendent comes in and talks to the church who are just having a tough time with what happened to their pastor, their leader. And he looks at them all and he says, you know what? It's about Jesus. It's not by works. It's by faith in Jesus is what it's all about. You see, it's not, maybe, let me back up, let me approach it from a different angle. Let's say it's great that a person is born and raised in the Jewish faith at this time. It's awesome. Paul even says this. Let me read it. He says, theirs is the adoption as sons. Theirs is the divine glory. Theirs is the covenants and the receiving of the law, the temple worship, the promises. Theirs is the patriarchs. And from them is traced the human ancestry of Jesus, who is God over all, forever to be praised. Amen. Is there a benefit? Is there a blessing of being a Jew? Absolutely, Paul says. But that pedigree will not save you. Just because, let me bring it up to today, just because you've been raised or born and raised in a Christian family, that's fantastic. Is that an advantage? Well, I would hope so, because we as a church encourage that, right? That you would raise your children in the church. That's important. Kids raised in the church, that being raised in a Christian home will not save you. It's by faith in Jesus. And Paul's saying, being that has that advantage. An advantage is great. But that doesn't save you. So this church in Rome is struggling at some level, and Paul is just answering their questions about the consistency of this message that he has for them. I want to tell a little story here that we might not see. Because Paul goes back and quotes all kinds of Old Testament references. And one of the things I appreciate about Paul is he doesn't always give the reference. He said, it is written. Or he'll just give quotes. Because it's kind of frustrating sometimes, especially as a pastor, is when you hear someone talk, and the only thing they do is just rattle off a bunch of scripture references. That's a distraction. I like what Paul says. He just quotes them. Because that's the truth. And Paul just read Romans. You just read all of the Old Testament references he uses. And one of the references he uses, because he says, therefore, I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy. It's a motivation. You will be motivated if you read the scriptures and know the mercies of God that he has for his people. If you would read that, you would be motivated to do what Paul wants us to do here. And how do we do that? You look at the mercies of God all through the Old Testament. One of them that Paul points out, you might not look at it as a mercy, but boy, you start examining it, it's fantastic. Let me tell the story. The story is this. Moses, of course, is the one who calls and it calls Israel, calls the Hebrew people out of Egypt. He says to Pharaoh, let my people go, and he calls them out. And he's bringing them out, and of course they cross the Red Sea, and they're on the way to Mount Sinai to receive the law. Moses leaves Israel and goes up on this mountain for 40 days. 40 days. These people have spent 50 days. He's up on the mountain. They haven't been that long in the wilderness. Not even in the wilderness. They're heading to Mount Sinai from the Red Sea. Anyway, so they get there. So Moses is up on this mountain for 40 days, and the people are just saying themselves, where'd he go? What's going on? And they're frustrated. They're getting frustrated, and they tell Aaron, and is like, where's Moses? What's going on here? Aaron, I am not sure what's going through his mind, but he says, let's plan a time of worship to Yahweh. And they start giving him gold and start giving him all this stuff, and they refine it, and what does he do? They fashion an idol instead of worshiping God. So Moses is up getting the law from God, getting the 10 Commandments. He comes down and sees this party going on. Not worshiping God. They're in sin, full tilt. We're free now. We're going to party and have a good time. Moses throws the 10 Commandments down. And he says, choose who are you going to follow? Who are you going to serve? He pronounces judgment. He goes back up the mountain. And he says, God, and God's pretty upset, obviously. But Moses goes to God and he says, God, don't leave us. God says, I will blot your names out. Moses says, please go with us. We need you. And at that time he says, God, I want to see your glory. I want to see you. And you know the story. God covers him in the cleft of a rock, and he sees the backside of God as God passes. I don't really understand all of that. But to say this, God's mercy was shown upon Israel at that time. God says to Moses, I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. I will have mercy. There's that word. And I will have mercy on whom I have mercy. God's amazing grace and mercy for you and me. I guess what I'm saying this morning is this. How many times have you blown it? How many times have you made mistakes? How many times have you looked at God and you wonder, like, God, does God even want me? Does God even care about me? My goodness, if you look at the Old Testament and see how many times that God put up with Israel for so many times that they would follow him and not follow him, follow him and not follow him, follow him and not follow him. A leader here, a king here, a bad king over here, back and forth, and all the crazy things that they did. But God's amazing love and grace continually, the long game that God has with you in your life. He cares about you. He loves you. He does not turn his back on you. He cares about you, and he is relentless. He will not give up. He will not quit. That's the beauty of this text. Therefore, I urge you. So you see Paul's desire for them. I urge you, therefore, brothers, in view of God's mercy. What will motivate you this morning is to really do what Romans chapter 12, 1 and 2 says, is not the fact that Paul is asking you to do it. What will motivate us this morning to do what Paul's asking us to do is because of God's mercy. You know, mercy, how do you define this word? It's just beautiful. It's an emotional desire to long to see someone affected by God's grace. It's an amazing draw. It's a longing. It's an emotion. It's passionate, and it's a motivator. When I see mercy, I don't know, this kind of sounds weird, but my older brother, Brent, it's like, he was always the big guy in the family, and he was all, you know what the older sibling is like. You always look up to them, And my brother was, he was good at football, he was good at baseball, he's good at basketball, and the tough kid in the school, and stuff. And he had a football that he got for his birthday. And there were 2 dogs in our backyard. And they had that football in both of their mouths. Stray dogs fighting like crazy in our backyard over this brand new football that my brother got. I saw Brent get up, a bat in his hand, ripped out the front door, went around into the backyard, and I'm going like, I'm watching this going, oh, this is going to be good. This is going to be good. This is going to be fun to watch. I'm sorry if you think I'm too violent this morning, but I'm sorry. That's just what I felt. So I go, this is going to be good. He gets the bat, and he gets over the dogs, and I can't believe how bold he was. He took the football out of their mouth, and I'm just ready for him to tee off on these dogs. And he sets the bat down, and he tells them, he just goes, go, get going. I was kind of let down. I go, what's this? You know what he taught me that day? He taught me mercy. And I just never forgot it. And I was young. In my eyes, those dogs deserved a licking. You know what I mean? They deserved it. They tore up his football. Instead, they just got shooed off. And I never forgot it. Because God, in our lives, there's time, if God would be just at this moment right now, none of us could tolerate it. None of us could. And that's the beauty of mercy. It's something that we all want. It's something we might not all give. But we all want it. And the motivation for mercy is to look at how God treated Israel all the way through. And still, Paul says, this calling to them is still offered. They can still turn. They can still follow me. And that's the beautiful mercy of God. And in your life, I urge you, therefore, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies a living sacrifice. I will continue this next Sunday because the word offer is so amazing. is so beautiful to offer. Notice it doesn't say, you better, or you better do this or else. I don't understand why we think that motivating people by force ever works. Are you there? People are motivated because they see God's mercy and His grace. It's like, wow, God really does love and care for me. Why not take advantage of that? Why not go to Him and fall into His hands of mercy? And we can offer that to Him. I'll get into this next week. I'll leave you with a little bit of taste. This is priestly right here at this moment. This is like a priestly element of this text. To offer yourselves as a living sacrifice. To offer, that's like you bring an offering. What would you do if you brought an offering? Let's see. I'm going to go find the cheapest, the sickest lamb I can find. Let's see. Let me find one that's got a lot of spots that don't really care. You know, it's kind of like giving to the needy or something. I'm just going to try to find the worst thing I can possibly bring. You know, that canned food up there that I'll never eat. Still there? Huh? No. You go and look for the best. You go and look for the best lamb, the best offering, the best sacrifice you can bring. And you bring it in. And you willingly offer it to the Lord. Because that's what love is. Love is an offering. It's a free choice to make for the Lord. Because in view of His mercy, that is the motivator. Every head bowed and every eye closed.